There's a certain kind of ache that has no name. It lives in the quiet between conversations. It lingers in the spaces where you're surrounded by people, yet feel utterly alone. You've likely felt it, that strange distance between you and the world. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've always carried something different inside you. Something heavier, something more sensitive, more alert, more awake. But no one ever told you what it was. They just called you too much, too sensitive, too intense, too quiet, or worse, weird. And so you learned early on to hide it, to fold your truth into the corners of your personality, to become who they needed, while secretly mourning who you really were. Carl Jung had a name for this spiritual ache. It's not depression. It's not anxiety. It's the deep, soul-level discomfort of a person who has been called to awaken, before the world around them is ready. You might be one of them, one of the few who feel things more deeply than they can explain, who ask questions no one wants to answer, who walk through life with a kind of inner gravity, as if carrying some invisible purpose that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. The world doesn't know what to do with people like you, because you don't fit the scripts. You don't respond to the conditioning. You don't stay numb when you're supposed to. You see through things, and that seeing is both your gift and your burden. Jung understood this path intimately. He knew that those who feel different often carry a calling, not a grand mission in the external world, but an internal one, to become whole. To answer that call, you have to step outside the tribe. You must leave the collective dream, and in doing so you are exiled, not always by others, but by your own awareness. Because once your eyes are open, you can't go back to sleep. You can't unsee the falseness. You can't unknow the lie. You can't pretend to be satisfied with the shallow when something deep inside you longs for truth. This is the wound of the chosen one. Not chosen by others, not chosen by fate, but chosen by the self, the deeper intelligence within you that says, this is not your final form. Go further. But going further costs you something. Your comfort, your identity, sometimes even your relationships. Because when you begin the process of individuation, of becoming who you really are, everything you're not begins to fall away. Jung warned us that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, not because we're weak, but because we've been trained to abandon ourselves to be loved, to belong, to survive. So what happens when you stop betraying yourself? The masks crack, the roles crumble, the persona you built to be accepted begins to rot at the edges, and beneath it, the real you emerges, raw, unfiltered, vulnerable. But the world doesn't applaud this unveiling. It resists it, because it sees you shedding the skin it gave you, and that makes others uncomfortable. Your transformation becomes a mirror, and most people are terrified of what they see in it, so they distance themselves. They project onto you. They mock your intensity. Or worse, they try to fix you. But you're not broken. You're becoming. You're experiencing the sacred discomfort of one who is no longer willing to pretend. And that process is violent, not physically but spiritually. It's a tearing apart of illusions, a breakdown of false attachments, a burning of the old to make space for the real. And while others are still asleep in the dream, you're wide awake in the fire. This is why you feel so different. Not because you're better, but because you're becoming conscious. And that consciousness comes at a price. Loneliness, confusion, spiritual fatigue, a deep, aching homesickness for something you can't even name. But in that ache lives the truth. You are not here to conform. You are here to transform, to become not what others expect, but what your soul has always known you were meant to be. That's why nothing makes sense anymore. That's why the old comforts feel hollow. That's why your heart won't settle for the easy answer. Because something in you remembers who you were before you learned to shrink, remembers the dreams you buried to stay safe, remembers the light you dimmed so others wouldn't feel threatened. And now, that memory is waking up. This is the beginning of your real journey. Not outward, but inward, toward your true self, toward the source of your knowing, toward the unshakable center that can only be found when every mask has been torn away. It's terrifying. It's lonely. But it is necessary, because only by walking this path, this painful, beautiful, sacred path, do you begin to understand. You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to remember who you are. The pain of being different isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in silence. A quiet ache in the chest when everyone else seems content with small talk, and your soul is screaming for something real. Other times it hides behind performance. Smiles that feel rehearsed, achievements that feel empty. A life that looks fine on the outside, but on the inside, feels like you're living someone else's dream. And this is where many chosen ones get stuck, in the limbo between two identities. The one the world accepts, and the one their soul is begging them to reclaim. Carl Jung knew this tension intimately. He saw how most people lived from their persona, the social mask they wear to survive. It's the version of you that plays nice, fits in, checks the boxes. But beneath the persona lies the self, the totality of your being, both conscious and unconscious. And the process of becoming that self is what Jung called individuation. Not self-improvement, not spiritual bypassing, not becoming a better version of your mask, but shedding the mask entirely and facing what's underneath. It sounds beautiful on paper, but in practice, it's excruciating, because everything that doesn't align with your true self must die. The relationships that were built on your performance, they start to fade. The career that once made you feel important, it begins to feel like a cage. The friends who loved your mask, they don't recognize you when you take it off. You lose what you once called your life, and in that loss you're reborn. But before the rebirth comes the grief. You grieve the identity you built to survive. You grieve the approval that once made you feel safe. You grieve the comfort of the known, because stepping into your truth means walking straight into the unknown. No roadmap, no applause, no guarantee that anyone will come with you. And that is where the deepest loneliness sets in, not because you're unlovable, but because you are no longer willing to betray yourself to be loved. And that level of integrity, it comes with a cost. It makes small talk unbearable. It makes toxic relationships obvious. It makes everything you once tolerated suddenly feel intolerable, because your soul is no longer willing to settle. Jung warned of this moment. He said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And that's what makes you different. You stopped avoiding. You turned inward. You listened. You felt the dissonance between the life you were living and the life you were meant for. And you didn't run from it. You let it break you open. But no one tells you how much that hurts. No one tells you that healing is just another word for dying to who you used to be. That becoming whole means facing everything you tried to hide. The shame, the anger, the fear, the unmet needs. Because the chosen one is not chosen for comfort. They're chosen for depth. To descend. To question. To unlearn. To feel what others numb. To see what others deny. And that descent into the shadow, into the unconscious, into the roots of your being, can feel like losing your mind. Because the world above, the world of norms and routines, keeps spinning. People keep going to work. They keep scrolling, drinking, smiling, numbing. And you're underwater, drowning in the truth of what you can no longer ignore. That most of what we call life is performance. That most of what we call success is distraction. That most of what we call love is conditional. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. So you pull away, not because you're bitter, but because your soul is detoxing from falseness. And in that pulling away, you start to hear the faintest sound, the voice of yourself, not your ego, not your wounded inner child, not your fears or your trauma, but the deeper self, the part of you that has always known the truth, but was buried beneath years of pretending. This voice doesn't shout, it whispers. It says things like, "You're allowed to leave what no longer fits. You don't need permission to evolve. You were never meant to fit into a system that runs on fear. You're not too much, you're just finally real." And slowly, painfully, powerfully, you begin to rebuild. But not from the outside in, from the inside out. You stop chasing validation and start seeking resonance. You stop performing and start embodying. You stop trying to be good enough and start being whole. And that shift changes everything. Your energy becomes different. Your presence deepens. You begin to draw in people who don't need you to shrink. People who recognize you not for what you produce, but for who you are. This is the quiet miracle of individuation. You begin to live not for applause, but for alignment. You don't need to be chosen by anyone else, because you've finally chosen yourself. But to get there, you had to walk through fire. You had to be alone in your truth. You had to question everything you were taught to believe. That's what makes your journey sacred. Not the outcome, but the courage it took to begin. That's what Carl Jung understood better than most. That the path to wholeness is not glamorous. It's not quick. It's not easy. It's brutal. It's humbling. It's real. And if you're walking that path now, feeling like a stranger to your old life, wondering if you're doing it wrong because it hurts so much, you're not broken. You're just awakening. There comes a moment in every chosen soul's journey when the pain becomes almost unbearable. You've seen the truth. You've taken the first steps. You've burned the old mask to ashes. And now, you're standing in the ruins. Not yet reborn. Not quite dead. Suspended in a space Jung called the middle way, where the ego is dissolving, but the self has not yet fully emerged. This is the existential desert, and it's here, more than anywhere else, that most people turn back. They go running to comfort, to religion, to lovers who never saw them, to careers that suffocate their soul. Not because they're weak, because the silence is too loud, because the weight of carrying a truth that no one around them understands is almost too much to bear. This is the phase where your mind plays tricks on you. It whispers, "You're crazy. You're lost. You've ruined everything. Just go back to who you were." But you can't. You know too much now. You've tasted the real. You've touched the fire. And this is what Carl Jung meant when he said, "Enlightenment is not imagining figures of light, but making the darkness conscious." Because the true shadow work isn't about spiritual aesthetics. It's not journaling with candles or doing breath work under a full moon. It's this, the confrontation with your inner chaos, with the parts of you that sabotage, with the bitterness that poisons your love, with the unhealed child inside you who still cries for validation, with the resentment that's been rotting beneath your smile. And when you face all of that without flinching, you start to transform, but not in some neat, Instagrammable way. It's messy. It's primal. It's terrifying. You'll cry in the car. You'll break down in the shower. You'll isolate not because you're depressed, but because you're becoming honest. You'll stop being available for things that drain you. You'll ghost people who never truly saw you. You'll question the systems that built your identity. And in that rebellion, you'll lose the version of yourself the world once adored. And that loss, it hurts, more than anyone tells you. Because you're not just letting go of people or patterns. You're letting go of who you had to be to survive. And that version of you, as false as it was still your protector. It kept you safe. It helped you belong. It gave you something to cling to when you were young and terrified and had no tools. But now it's time to bury it. With reverence, with gratitude, and with grief. Because every rebirth requires a death. Jung warned that modern people are starved not for information, but for meaning. And the chosen ones? They feel that starvation in their bones. They see the hollowness in society's rituals, the performativity in relationships, the sedation in entertainment, and it leaves them gasping for something real, even if that real comes wrapped in suffering. So they descend into myth, into psyche, into the depths of their own unconscious, not to escape, but to understand, because at a certain point, pain becomes a teacher, and alienation becomes an initiation, and the wound becomes a portal to something deeper than happiness, deeper than success, deeper than love as the world defines it, a portal to wholeness. But wholeness doesn't look like perfection. It looks like contradiction held in the same breath. It looks like joy that coexists with sorrow. It looks like strength that is birthed through vulnerability. It looks like knowing you could play the game, but choosing not to, because the chosen one isn't someone with a special destiny. They're someone who has chosen to stop lying to themselves. And when you stop lying, you begin to suffer consciously, which, paradoxically, is where healing begins. Because the moment you suffer consciously, you're no longer a victim of your pain. You become its alchemist. You start to see that the loneliness was not punishment. It was space. Space to hear your own voice. Space to detach from what never fit. Space to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. You realize the relationships that fell apart were not failures. They were filters, removing anything that couldn't hold your truth. You understand that the breakdown wasn't destruction. It was cleansing, of false identity, of karmic residue, of the ancestral baggage you were brave enough to stop passing on. And that shift, it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not even visible to most people. But inside something cracks open, not in pain, in power. You begin to trust your intuition, not because it's woo or mystical, but because it's the one thing that's never lied to you. You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop censoring your magic. You stop trying to be digestible for people who were never meant to understand you. And you begin to live for resonance, not recognition, for presence, not performance, for truth, not safety. Because once you've tasted truth, safety becomes a prison. You are no longer willing to trade your soul for comfort. This is the shadow initiation. It doesn't end with a reward. It ends with clarity. And with clarity comes power. Not the power to control others, but to own yourself. That's the real meaning of being chosen. You weren't chosen to save the world. You were chosen to save yourself, to reintegrate what was lost, to reclaim your voice, to embody your truth, fully, unapologetically, relentlessly. And in doing so, you give silent permission to others to do the same. By now, you've walked through the fire. You've faced the silence. You've grieved the person you once pretended to be. And somewhere in that sacred loneliness, something unexpected began to happen. You started coming home. Not to a place, not to a role, but to a feeling, a remembering of who you were before the pain, before the world made you forget, before you were taught that love must be earned, truth must be hidden, and belonging must be bought through self-abandonment. You're no longer at war with yourself. You've stopped exiling the parts of you that felt too much. You've stopped hiding the strangeness, the wildness, the softness, the rage. You've stopped trying to be healed in order to be worthy, and instead, you've learned to hold your wholeness as it is. Carl Jung believed that the goal of the soul was not perfection, but integration. And integration means this: you no longer chase light to escape your darkness. You no longer chase purpose to cover your pain. You no longer chase love to avoid facing your inner orphan. You turn toward it all. You hold the contradictions. You dance with your shadows instead of banishing them. You learn to say, yes, this is me too, because you now understand. The things that made you feel different were never a flaw. They were a compass. Your sensitivity? It wasn't weakness. It was radar. Your pain? Not punishment. A portal. Your depth? Not drama. It was always your truth trying to speak. And this whole time, while the world tried to mold you, medicate you, mute you, your soul was whispering, you are meant to remember the self beneath the mask, to remember the archetype behind the ego, to remember that you were never just here to survive. You were here to awaken. That's why the old world felt so hollow. That's why the job, the approval, the relationship didn't satisfy you. Because you weren't designed to live a scripted life. You were designed to live mythically, to walk the path of the mystic, the creative, the questioner, the soul diver, to be one of the rare few who feel the currents beneath the world and dare to follow them. And that path isn't easy. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't offer a linear map. It doesn't promise that anyone will understand. But it's real, and it's yours. That's the gift of being different. You were never meant to follow. You were meant to lead, not others, but your own inner exiled parts, to go where your soul is calling, to tend to the forgotten pieces, to resurrect what you buried to be accepted. And now that you've faced the shadow, you see something most people never will. The shadow is not your enemy. It's your missing self. It holds your creativity, your sexuality, your hunger for life. It holds your boundaries, your no, your fire, your right to exist as you are. And when you reclaim it, not with shame, but with reverence, you become whole again. That wholeness is quiet. It doesn't scream for validation. It doesn't need to be liked. It doesn't fear rejection, because it's rooted in something deeper than identity. It's rooted in the self, what Jung called the organizing principle of the psyche, the bridge between the personal and the collective, the axis around which your truth orbits. You are not just a person navigating life. You are an unfolding myth, a sacred tension, a living, breathing symbol of what it means to evolve. So what now? Now you live, not perfectly, not always peacefully, but authentically. You let your presence become your protest. You let your art become your altar. You let your nervous system become your compass. You say no when you mean it. You say yes without guilt. You speak even if your voice trembles. You rest even when the world tells you to hustle. You forgive yourself 1,000 times a day. And most of all, you remember that you are not alone. Because for every chosen one walking silently through their dark night, there are others, awakening, stumbling, remembering, just like you. And together, even from a distance, you form a constellation of souls, each one shining not because they're perfect, but because they chose to keep becoming. This is the revolution. Not in politics, not in headlines, but in consciousness. In every moment a soul decides not to betray itself again. In every breath someone takes when they could have dissociated. In every tear someone lets fall instead of holding it in. This is what it means to be chosen. Not chosen to be above, but to go within, to feel what others run from, to heal what others suppress, to awaken not for escape, but for embodiment. And if you've made it this far on the path, if you've kept your heart open in a world that taught you to shut down, you're not just different, you're brave. You've chosen consciousness over comfort, integrity over image, wholeness over approval. That's the real path. That's the real power. And that is your birthright. Subscribe to the Awakened Compass and join our membership to unlock the full journey within.